Do 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 do. We have to make another video.
This day, James Baldwin said, took many years of vomiting up all the filth that I had been taught about myself and halfway believed before I could walk around this earth like I had the right to be here. I have the right, you have the right, we all have the right.
Take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society.
There's a photo of Billy Porter kissing Joe Biden's hand at Juneteenth concert at the White House during Pride Month. During Pride Month. During Pride Month. We're going to jump straight into it. Billy Porter has been in the news over the last few days because he attended a Juneteenth concert at the White House during Pride Month in 2024, along with a long list of other celebrities like Gladys Knight, Kamala Harris, our Black VP was there. If you haven't seen any of my other Billy Porter, James Baldwin, Black Radical History videos, please check them out. The first thing that I want to start with this video with is the biggest question that I want to explore when thinking about this topic that I think is really useful to center us. How can or does the desire to be legible to the state become a slippery slope? I mean, we have a Black woman as president, and we call her Kamala Harris. It's just too much. It's too much. So why is this event causing so much controversy? Why do people care? Why is this such a big deal? Well, the fact that there's a Juneteenth concert at the White House is already interesting enough. And to give you a quick history lesson, the reason that Juneteenth is so important is that it goes one single step beyond that cursory perspective. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, there were still so many racists and Confederates and Southerners that thought that they needed slavery on an economic level to the point that they kept enslaved people for 2.5 years after they were free. They got 2.5 years of free labor, 2.5 years of being able to torture more enslaved Black Americans. And when we think about justice and restoration and both the complexity of racial violence and also the simplicity of it, Juneteenth is such a clear example of the fact that white people, capitalists, are gonna fucking lie to get their check. And the White House was built by slaves. And now there's a Juneteenth concert there while there's numerous genocides happening during Pride Month. The reason that both of these holidays are so important is that they speak to a slightly deeper reading of history. They're an entryway. They're something that newer people to either Black history or queer history can kind of dig into and kind of think, okay, there's some contradictions here at play, and these contradictions help me look at the world that I live in today, and that is helpful. And within either of these topics, there are so many other forms of history. Beyond the Emancipation Proclamation, we can talk about chain gangs. We can talk about the complexity of segregation. We can talk about Black codes. We can talk about maroon societies. We can talk about all of the different configurations of how Black people have fought to free themselves beyond the reform or the permission of a government like the United States. And the same can be said for queer and LGBTQIA people. The fact that trans women have had to find their own forms of healthcare, that activists like Marsha P. Johnson did housing support for LGBTQIA people in New York City, that the ball culture and the different houses are literally subversive formations that allow queer and trans people to protect each other, build resources, and live outside of the margins because the system has locked us out. We as a collective, as the masses, still have a chance to decide what these events mean. Instead of going to the state-sanctioned pride in your city, you might want to go to something like a community pride, because pride festivals and pride months that are run in state-sanctioned have a long history of state violence. And I can think of a local example. In 2016 or 17 here in Ohio, there was the Black Pride 4, a group of Black activists that went into the street to disrupt Pride after yet another killing of an unarmed Black person. and they were beaten up, tackled, and promptly arrested. And I think even one of the black trans women that was arrested was even spit on. And I interviewed them a few years ago. And so when we look at these events, we can see them as a sort of clashing of these different ideals. And these clashing of ideals definitely have to do with the fact that so much of modern Americanism as we know it, is built on the backs of marginalized people fighting for their human rights, and then that struggle for progress being so easily enfolded into what America considers itself, which is the greatest democracy in the world. But how can it be the greatest democracy in the world if it has literally been built upon the subjugation of poor people? These holidays, these rituals, these institutions that are here to commemorate marginalized history are an opportunity to have a deeper reading of what is happening, what has happened then, and what is happening now. And then what is also interesting about this Juneteenth White House moment, it's the context of Biden. Joe Biden is a president that has both a long and interesting history in relation to racial politics and also a long and interesting history in related to LGBTQIA rights and politics. Joe Biden has famously said just last month that what is happening in Gaza is not genocide. We can see that Joe Biden is clearly aligned with Israel. We can see that he's clearly fearful of making a strong humanitarian stance. And to say that what is happening in Gaza is not genocide, it's semantics. When actually, if the same kind of military operations were to be happening in the US, it would easily be called genocide because Americans are considered human beings in our Western context. Palestinians, terrorists, Hamas, Israeli propaganda tells us that Palestinians are not human beings. They're terrorists. When we look at Biden's history, we can also see that Biden is a career politician. Remember when Biden was running for president against Kamala Harris and there was that famous debate where Kamala said, F you, Joe, basically, you supported segregationalists.
And it's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing.
Everything I've done in my career, I ran because of civil rights. I continue to think we have to make fundamental changes in civil rights. And those civil rights, by the way, include not just only African Americans, but the LGBT community.
But
we did it. We did it, Joe. You're going to be the next president of the United States.
And there's even a CNN article titled Biden on his past praise of segregationalist senators. Working with or praising segregationalists, Biden praised the Mississippi Senator John Stennis, a staunch segregationalist, as a hero and as the rock-bound integrity of the United States Congress in the 1980s. Biden called Stennis a hell of a guy in 2008. Biden also praised South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, who ran for president as a segregationalist in 1948 as a Dixiecrat. In 1993, Biden spoke at Thurmond's 90th birthday and praised him by comparing him to Confederate General E. Lee.
Russell Senate Office Building, where mostly white men spoke to history in grand lyrics of the principles they held dear. Richard Russell said this: "As one who was born and reared in the atmosphere of the Old South, with 6 generations of my forebears now resting beneath Southern soil, I am willing to go as far and make as great a sacrifice to preserve and ensure white supremacy in the social, economic, and political life of our state as any man who lives within her borders." That's Richard Russell, the senator from Georgia, who was willing to lay down his life for white supremacy.
And if you go back and check out my video on MLK and Bayard Rustin, there is a point in it where I talk about the context for why the March on Washington was so important. And a large part of that is because Dixiecrats, the kind of politician that's mentioned here, were regularly blocking legislation to demand an end for segregation, to demand school integration. And so Dixiecrats were essentially some of the most to me, staunch conservatives, because they were so economically driven by racism and or being upset that segregation was, that the civil rights movement was pushing for black rights, that they opposed all. And the reason that it's important to look at Biden's history in relation to his stances on segregation and racial politics is that we have to look at politicians as people that perform and parrot the political context of their jobs while also trying to be legible in terms of history. So if Biden can praise people that were literally supporting segregation, that were supporting busing, that were blocking legislation that pushed for civil rights, and now to have a black woman as your vice president and to claim that you care about racial politics, where is the point of actual reconciliation, confrontation, and restoration of the damage that you did? It's just like when I read about these people that are world leaders, that are politicians, that are sitting at tables and deciding things that affect all sorts of global conflicts, things that affect military budgets, military operations, media, our perspectives on global issues. It's Joe Biden leading this shit. I think a core term that we should be thinking about when we're looking at this whole conversation and process, why would Billy Porter be at the White House? Why would these other black people be at the White House? Juneteenth is something for black people. The White House is literally built by slaves. We have to talk about assimilation. Assimilation refers to the process through which individuals or groups adopt the cultural traits, behaviors, and norms of another group. Even for my family, assimilation looked like when my mother came to the US in the late 70s, she was at the very tail end of desegregation busing. And for those that don't know, desegregation busing is when instead of desegregating schools completely and allowing black children and white children to all go to the same schools in the same neighborhood, desegregation busing was a sort of compromise between people that wanted integration and segregationalists to instead say, all right, we don't want to integrate, but instead you take some kids from that black school and we'll bus them to a white neighborhood. We'll take some kids from our white neighborhood and bus them to a black school. And my mother was immediately, as a Jamaican teenager, thrown into an environment where people were making fun of the way that she talked, where she was bullied, harassed. And your first kind of months and experiences with other people in the US is through the lens of racism and being otherized. And so eventually my mother had to learn how to talk a certain way. She had to learn how to adjust to the weather, to even the ways of policing here in the US. Those things that she had to learn were also lessons that she passed on to me as her black child. When you go outside, don't wear your hoodie up. Don't wear your headphones in. Know where you're walking. Know who's around you. Don't look suspicious. If you're walking late at night, walk on the other sidewalk if there's a woman ahead of you on the sidewalk. Don't take any pills from your friends in college. Don't do the things that those white kids do. And so assimilation can look like a lot of different things. It can look like cultural pressure to look and reflect a certain version of whiteness or European standards of beauty. It can look like double consciousness, as W.E.B. Du Bois states, which is this notion that black people have to both define ourselves for ourselves, but in order to survive white supremacy and anti-blackness and colonization, we have to understand how we are perceived, how we can be criminalized. We have to understand the colonial perspective of ourselves in order to survive a colonial existence. And then assimilation can also look like a loss of identity. Think of how many people from other cultures immigrate to the US and the second and third generations of their children struggle to know their language, struggle to know their culture. So assimilation can look like the wide ways that white supremacy, anti-blackness, and colonization can show up in our social, political, and economic spaces. And if you haven't yet, there is a really good piece called The Characteristics of White Supremacy that I think aligns with the topic that we're talking about a lot right now. Some of these things can look like perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality. All of these are things that we can see present in our current US political system and also in a figure like Billy Porter, which I've talked about extensively in other videos. Billy Porter is a queer person who has survived the AIDS crisis, who is a queer black actor who probably gets paid a lot less than other people, but also in many ways views himself as a peer to other celebrities and performers that have gotten their EGOT. And so what does it say that Billy Porter is aligning with a lot of these characteristics in his pursuit of this acclaim or this success, the individualism of saying, I don't need to care about what's happening to the Palestinians over there in that Guardian interview, the historical reductionism of saying, we don't need to really worry about James Baldwin's stances on the Middle East. We just need to worry about his civil rights stuff. And this is why talking about a queer assimilation is so important as well. For queer individuals, assimilation often involves conforming to heterosexual norms and concealing one's sexual orientation or gender identity. Some of the ways that this can look is heteronormativity. It's the dominant expectation that everyone is heterosexual and adheres to traditional gender roles. Even this one, I have to tell you, like the heteronormativity element, I think it's ingrained in so much of LGBTQIA culture, of course, but the simplest way that I relate to this is when I go out with women, like cis women, in a predominantly straight space, I feel anxiety about being read as queer because I think it otherizes me and can make me like targetable. So even if we look at assimilation, it can show up in our body as a signal of fear. And that, to W.E.B. Du Bois's point about double consciousness, there's also this phrase that people have coined, which is triple consciousness, having numerous identities at play that put you at risk that you also have to be conscious of. So even the Black queer experience is tied to this. The struggle towards a marriage equality and how whitewashed so much of that mainstream media struggle was. And if we look at the LGBTQIA community since then, there has been this increasing divide between who are the gay people in the community, the people with the more normative politics that are able to align with the state or some aspect of domesticity, versus the queer kind of resilience and imagining of life. People that want to abolish gender, people that are okay with living in the binaries, people that have a politic that rejects many of the things that I think marriage equality assumed. Some of the clearest historical examples that we can think of is the house slave versus the field slave, which is a kind of dichotomy that Malcolm X especially coined as a central figure of the civil rights movement, who was also very much he was in staunch opposition to reform, to these notions of assimilation. If you listen to MLK's speeches all throughout, you can hear this rejection of needing to be legible or respectable to have one's human rights. You can hear this rejection of participating in a history being handed to us. And you can also hear a demand for a certain kind of specificity around how we understand, read, and think about Black culture.
We're nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us, but we are not nonviolent with anyone who is violent with us.
Anytime you demonstrate against segregation and a man has the audacity to put a police dog on you, kill that dog. I'm telling you.
Even earlier, I was listening to a Malcolm X speech, and I think it was like Message from the Grassroots, and literally he shows up to this speech and he's apologizing because his house was essentially firebombed the night before. His stuff was burned up. He kept apologizing and saying, oh, if I stutter during this speech, I'm sorry because I'm kind of frazzled. I wouldn't usually be like this, but it felt important for me to be here. And so even with Malcolm X and this classic dichotomy between Malcolm X and MLK, we can see this very real struggle. Like, I think throughout Black history, the question of assimilation has always been the dichotomy between abolition or reform. When enslaved Blacks were working in the slave fields from sunup to sundown, there were some people that were willing to upend their lives as they knew it in order to run off into the marches, to flee to freedom, to face hunger and starvation and brutal attacks in order to get to the North through the Underground Railroad or other means. And then there were people that were more invested in some of what they saw as the perceived safety of being more closely aligned with the slave master. Think of the house slaves, the overseers on the plantation, the Blacks that would actively tell on other people that were trying to flee to freedom because they thought, if they flee and some of the brunt comes back on me, I don't want to have to deal with that. I see reform as the fear that we can't do individually or collectively what is necessary to keep us safe, whether it be within a friend group or a family or a neighborhood or a city. I believe that humans have the capacity to get to a point where we can collectively protect each other without handing that over to an institution. But reform, I think, digs into this underlying fear that human beings are inherently evil and selfish, and we need these objective institutions to step in. But the reality is that these institutions such as policing, jailing, the prison system, the prison industrial conflict are all aligned with racial bias, which is extremely and inherently anti-Black and anti-poor. If we're looking at the prison industrial complex and why it's criticized, it's the fact that it is a modern form of slavery. And so when we look at kind of why slavery existed in the first place, which was a capitalistic demand on behalf of the colonizer and the white person, what does it mean for us to be in a modern era where Black people can represent democracy, when Black people can represent unity, and when Black people can represent equality via Black capitalism? And so in this whole discussion of Black assimilation, there is this question of, where does Black capitalism and Black participation in this kind of colonial way of relating to each other, where does it lead? And can it lead to Black liberation?
When a white man tears down a prison, he is trying to liberate himself. When I tear down a prison, I'm simply turning into another savage. Because you don't understand that you, for me, are my prisoner. You are my warden. I am battling you.
And the easy answer is, it does not. And in this whole discussion of reform and liberation, there is the essential question of, when do we relinquish our participation? I think part of the reason that so many people are disgusted by Billy Porter being at the White House and kissing Joe Biden's hand is that we have this idea that queer elders and queer Black people inherently know what to do when they recognize the evils of the system, that they guide the way. If you see a lot of Billy Porter's public appearances, you can see the way that all of this trauma built into his experience as a queer Black person has instead pushed him towards, I need to get my own in order to establish the right kind of representation, in order to be one of the big Black references in media that people can think about when they think of Blackness and queerness. And what is missing there is an actual commitment to the more liberatory aspects of Black history that will make lots of Black people, lots of queer Black people actually admire you. And when you're willing to throw your own culture under the bus via celebrating at the White House during a Juneteenth concert, trying to co-opt James Baldwin's legacy, talking down to your other female coworkers, all of these things, your success matters more than your participation in a collective liberatory process. And that can be asked and said for all of the Black people that were at this White House Juneteenth event. This is the tricky area of Blackness, queerness, survival, and how it's important for us to be specific about why we're critiquing each other, because I don't judge other queer Black people for surviving. I judge other queer Black people for surviving and throwing their own history and culture under the bus for their own individual gain. And so to end this video, I want to remind us that Pride started with a riot, that Black liberation has always stemmed from subversion, from escape, from confrontation, from direct confrontation with the exact individuals and systems that have oppressed us. Our answer is not going to the White House, chucking and jiving for a check while co-opting our own histories and wanting to call that some form of liberation. And what I think is sinister in all of this is that representation has become kind of synonymous with reform, instead of actually giving people human rights, of drastically changing these institutions, of radically looking at our history, of demanding reparations or restorative justice. Instead, we're giving lackluster representation that is meant to soothe us into believing that we are an equal and benefited part of this system, when in actuality, this system has always aimed to destroy us and is only continuing to reform how it destroys us. And it's also continuing to demand that we reform how we participate in it. Kissing genocidal fucking Joe's hand during Pride Month. Controversy, the importance of talking about it, the importance of getting to these specifics, whether it be our historical relations to reform or abolition or assimilation, or how it shows up today. And I want to end with a piece that I actually wrote almost 10 years ago. It's titled, Where Does Black Rage Go? As I sit at lunch surrounded by countless white people who probably didn't know the name of Alton Sterling, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Rekia Boyd, or John Crawford, I knew that there was a big question in my mind waiting to be answered. Are we really a country, a people, a nation that forgets so easily? What about the slave ships, the shackles, the salt water and rats gnawing at dead bodies piled on top of each other in those seaward vessels of wood? What about the Japanese internment camps, the bombings, the drones, the corralling of indigenous people to schools meant to civilize them, the police raiding gay bars, shoving women to the ground, ripping wigs off of people in drag, spitting on them in jail cells? What about the conversion therapy camps? What about bringing Christian fundamentalism to an island that my family calls home and teaching homophobia? I look around and I see people sitting in their homes, quiet and gentle and numb as they watch the news, and I fear that that will be me one day. I don't want to sleepwalk through my life working job after job for my own benefit as the world continues to burn. Where does Black rage go? If I had to guess, it would start with a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates, "In between the world and me." So I feared not just the evidence of this world, but the rules designed to protect me from it. The rules that would have you contort your body to address the block, and to contort again to be taken seriously by colleagues, and contort again as to not give the police a reason. All my life, I'd heard people talk to their Black boys and Black girls to be twice as good, which is to say, accept half as much. These words would be spoken with a veneer of religious nobility, as though they evidenced some unspoken quality, some undetected courage, when in fact all they evidenced was the gun to our head and the hand in our pocket. This is how we lose our softness. This is how they steal our right to smile. How do we escape this labyrinth of suffering? It starts with the acknowledgement that the struggle for freedom is going to hurt, but would you rather let the suffering go on? Maybe Black rage never went anywhere. It's just a matter of how we use it. Thank you for watching another one of my videos. Let me know what you think about this Billy Porter moment at the White House. Is it an example of Juneteenth? Is it a further manifestation of the complex ways that white supremacy compels Black people to reform and contort ourselves into the American project? Or is it something else? And stay tuned, because pretty soon I'm going to be releasing a Black Reader #1, which is a collection of essays about Black historical figures and the connection between Black liberation and Palestinian liberation. I'm really excited for this. It's going to be out on Juneteenth, so check the description, check the other links in my social media. And I want to thank everyone that has been watching my videos, following me on my social media feeds. I'm really just viewing this as an opportunity to research, to learn, to talk about things that I care about, that I talk about to my friends anyway. And it's helping me learn a lot, do a lot, video edit. And so if you want to support me in this channel, comment, like, and share. Become a member on this channel, because you can for a few bucks a month, or join my Patreon because you'll always get early access to these videos. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.